This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and the rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother in Oklahoma City. The world has been an active place since we looked up from our concerns during Lent. Of course, we look around at our spiritual interests and our growth in discipleship, and it's easy to allow the hurly-burly of every day to just get past us. But as we settle into our appreciation of the resurrection and the conquest of the powers of death by Jesus, the Son of God, it's important to take the time to look around at what's going on in our lives. As it turns out, it's really quite a bit. Speaking of the resurrection, we spend a good amount of time embracing the conquest of the powers of death. The oldest story in the world, the power of killing to accomplish the work of making the world a better place, that's displaced by the initiative of Jesus coming back from the dead. It's often a surprise to acknowledge how important killing is to the work of the world, but civilization would be a tough place without it. That's what Caiaphas understood when he stood up to deliver the verdict on Jesus' crucifixion. He said, "It's better for one man to suffer, to be killed, than the whole nation be destroyed." And that's how it happened. The Jewish authorities worked with the Roman governor in order to eliminate the problem of Jesus from their society. Killing Jesus was the answer to their problem, and they embraced it. And even though we Christians celebrate the power of the resurrection and how it broke the powers of death, we're still tempted to turn to death to solve our problems. Even though we are 2,000 years on the other side of Easter Sunday, one of our irresistible temptations is to turn to the power of death to keep society turning in its accustomed groove, greased always by killing and dying. Even a cursory nod toward the history of the 20th century and what we have so far accomplished in the 21st century is to understand that we're a long way from the conquest of the powers of death in our day and time. Jesus rose to the acclamation of the angels that the powers of death might be cheated of their victims. As St. Paul said, if the powers of this world had known they had killed the Lord of glory, they would not have done it. 2,000 years on the other side of this mistake by the powers of this world, and those powers are still getting their licks in. We still lean heavily on killing to make the world a better place. The cultural theorist René Girard explained the death toll in a very insightful formula. In the course of human society, he wrote, it was discovered that victimizing and killing the outcast was a way to keep people focused away from their disagreements with each other as they looked toward the disagreeable persons outside. So, for example, if we all agree that, say, the Russians in the Cold War are the problem, or the Comanches are on the plains, or the Confederates in the South, or the witches across the tracks, then we can focus on them and eliminate them. And when we're all turning in their direction, we don't have to worry about the disagreeable neighbor across the street whose trash blows across my lawn, or, my brother in Cincinnati who gets all the breaks and makes all the money. If we're shooting at our enemies and killing the threat over there, we can be at peace with one another. That's Girard's point of view. Remember what President Reagan said. He said the Cold War would be over if Mars invaded. We'd all be looking at Martians, and the Russians would become our brothers. That's how the world works. But what happens when the power of killing begins to become undone? The first response would be to make sure the machinery of making enemies and killing people is beefed up. The answer to Jesus undermining the machinery of killing and dying is to make sure we've done a better job at killing, which is a pretty good description of the 20th century. As the story of Christ and the message of the gospel penetrates more and more into the fabric of the world, the rate of killing becomes more and more extreme. By the time we got to about 1900 years after the resurrection, whole nations were turning out to murder and to die in numbers no one had imagined possible. It's a kind of reflex. Think about it. What do you do when you get on the elevator and punch the button to go to the 12th floor and nothing happens. Rather than wait to see what you can do next, the first thing you do is you punch the button 10 times, even after you know it's not working. As a civilization, we've punched the Caiaphas buttons 10 times, 100,000 times, and as we got to the 1900s, 100 million times, just to make sure it's still working, because we wanted to make sure that we were trying to make it work like it should. By the time the beginning of the third millennium rolled around, we had collected upward of 150 million murders in the 20th century in order to make the world keep working in our favor as people. Most of the time, we don't think of what it costs us to endure this 20th century. In fact, as René Girard points out, one of the convenient parts of the machinery of killing and dying for the good of society is that we almost never notice it as an outrage. Oh, sure, we had a temporary explosion of concern about concentration camps and Nazis and Arbeit macht frei and those 6 million Jews whose ashes went up the flues there. But in our hypersensitivity to that sacred number, we brushed over the 7 million Chinese civilians killed by the Japanese army, the 5.5 million Ukrainians starved to death by the Soviets, the 9 million killed in the gulags, and the roughly 40 million killed by the Chinese communists in their accession and clutching to power. That doesn't include, of course, the casualties from World War I and World War II and the colonial wars as part of the Cold War, or the lives that everyone was willing to put at risk in our strategy of mutually assured destruction that could have seen 50 million people dead in a particularly bad afternoon of a nuclear exchange that we just about had in 1962. The amazing part is that all of this has happened and we mostly haven't looked up from our newspapers. Killing and dying to make the world is simply a part of the world making, and we hardly even notice. The amazing part of these numbers is that we've not gotten much better at noticing. With our immediate communications at the speed of light and our power to summon information instantaneously, we haven't stopped to appreciate anything of what we could do. We're still perfectly comfortable to grease the skids of our broken society and make sure the brutality of the world doesn't keep our expectations of the world from being realized. We're still managing to make the world we want by supplying the bodies. In fact, we've not slowed down at all in providing the lives for the death machine that is our civilization. Oh, sure, we're not savages like the old folks used to be. We don't entrust warlords or dictators like in times past. There aren't Pontius Pilate, Herod, and Nero to satisfy as we go about our lives in the 21st century. They're remnants of the past, ghosts only, whose memories no one cherishes. But our conviction that killing and dying to make the world a better place has gone on unabated. And I must add, it has gone on with all our enthusiasm. This might not sound quite like us these days. After all, we're not lining up our soldiers shoulder to shoulder and rushing them toward the enemy trenches, nor are we herding millions of our countrymen into camps so they might perish so as to stifle dissent in our ranks. As a matter of fact, we in the Western world, who have benefited most from a culture formed by the proclamation of the resurrection, we've done the most to hone our sensitivities about killing and dying. Compared to much of the rest of the world, we're highly attuned to the beauty of life and the importance of the individual. Nowhere in the world does anyone approach our concerns about human rights and the value of each person. We shiver at what people in times past did in the name of making society work. In fact, we have repented mightily of what our own ancestors did to make their societies go. We denounce the horrors of slavery and the soul-crushing, dark, satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution, the inhumanity of racism, the decimation of the Native American, the demeaning scourge of sexism, the sterility of ecological catastrophe and global climate crises, the barrenness of sexual prudery, the narrowness of gender conformity, and all the other great awareness we've grown into in our age. In another age, it was thought to be no more than collateral damage to dismiss the entire half of humanity because the she's of this world weren't man-like enough. And all the while, we didn't notice that. And now we do. We've stopped punching the button and are aware that we have to do better. As the author Steven Pinker insists, we are doing better. In fact, we're doing better than ever before, he says. Girard has always made the claim that the great challenge facing us is to grow beyond the insistence of killing and dying into a world of forgiving and forbearing. Rather than make the world work by taking life, we'll eventually have to face the challenge of giving life and making life work. The great Christian civilizational challenge is always to move past the first step of depending on killing and come to the next step, which is learning how to live together and solve our problems without resorting to the violence that we're so in love with. While we have a lot to be embarrassed about, the Western world leads the way in acknowledging the individual, the rights of the minority, the value of each person, and the priceless asset of the soul. As the author Gil Bailey pointed out, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wasn't put together in Riyadh or Tokyo or Nairobi or Bangkok, but in San Francisco. The good news is that the world is Western and the West is Christian, at least in sentiment. Except that we're abandoning the gift of the resurrection. Or, that is to say, even as we've moved toward the gift of our appreciation of what it means to be human, we still trust in killing to grease the skids of our world. And we've done so with the enthusiasm that would make a Roman general blush or an African slave trader flinch. In the course of the last 50 years, we've found it congenial to kill 65 million children in their mothers' wombs here in the U.S., all in the name of making our world work better. Around the world, the death toll in abortion has been nearly 1 billion, and the enthusiasm for it has not yet begun to wane. Killing is still the official solution for making our society work out the way we want, in the eyes of at least half the people in our country. Just a few years ago, with the Dobbs decision at the Supreme Court, it seemed as if we had turned the corner. Abortion as a policy was no longer untouchable. It appeared there might be some changes in the practice and therefore in the support for it in our polity. But it turns out not to be so. What I've seen is that the enthusiasm for it has reached epic proportions. I used to think that when we could have a conversation about abortion that wasn't tinged by the stilted rigidity of making sure everybody had to agree, we'd all begin to understand it for what it is, and our political enthusiasm for it would change. When we all understood it to be the intentional killing of a human being in order to achieve what we want for our society, we'd turn away from it. We are, after all, a Christian people. For decades, the political support for it was clouded with euphemism and indirection. Seeing it for what it is, I figured, would be the first step to lessening support for it. But it has not been so. Just recently, the political commentator Bill Maher on his program described the new enthusiasm for it. He mentioned that, quote, many people think it's murder. And it kind of is. And I'm okay with it. There are 8 billion people on the planet. We won't miss you, unquote. Now, you have to admit that sentiment, spoken on his program in front of the camera on a national platform with millions watching, is chilling in every way. He's not a political scientist or a moral philosopher, but he does reflect the thinking of most people, which is how his program stays on the air. So it's clear we're now at a point in which we're comfortable as a polity in saying it's murder, it's the unjust killing of the innocent, but it's fine. Because, it's convenient to my purposes. The blood and gore of ending an innocent human life is the grease we need for the gears of our civilization to mesh. It's not just in the U.S. The country of France has become the first nation to enshrine abortion into its constitution. That makes abortion a fundamental right of a human being. The right to seize the life of an innocent human being is now a part of the definition of what it means to be a citizen in that country. To protest the practice of abortion in France is to contravene the rights of every citizen. Well, as long as that citizen is born. It's not clear if there will be limits. After all, most European countries have a 12-week limit. We'll have to wait and see if France's right will be exercised without limit and meet the barbarity enshrined in the majority of states in the U.S. in which abortion has no practical limit up to the moment of delivery. For nearly a millennia, France has led the way in what it means to practice statecraft and Christian life. It would appear the country has now chosen to lead in a different direction. Now, no one knows where this takes us. The promise of the resurrection is that the power of death is broken, but this power remains among us. It's used because its efficacy in getting things done is still real. Killing still produces what we want, which is why we invoke it and practice it so readily and embrace it so thoroughly. Turning away from the powers of this world to embrace the gift of freedom from death and intimidation, that helped to create a Christian society that evolved to protect life and liberty. Embracing a new enthusiasm for killing is to abandon the gift we have been given. This has consequences, this abandonment, that we mostly don't imagine. In the words of John Daniel Davidson from The Federalist, quote, "What this means in practice, of course, is a society in which power and force, not democracy or human rights or universal moral principles, rule the day. This is why the most advanced pagan societies have always taken the form of slave empires. They are societies in which power alone determines what is right," unquote. The power to designate the child in the womb as not worthy of protection, because while it is indisputably human, we have determined it not to be embraced by our concern. That power is to surrender any claims to universal obligations to defend or to protect life. Killing is not only useful to us, it's accompanied by blindness and deafness. We simply turn away in the killing and refuse to count the bodies. There's no better definition of moral numbness. That always leads, of course, to more killing. As we cast our eyes to our past, having had a moment in which we awaken to the horrors of their indifference to the value of human life, we are left agog at what our predecessors thought they were doing. Now we're in the middle of abandoning the resurrection promise that death has no more power over us because killing and dying are not effective levers to turn the world in our direction. As this happens, the whole of society becomes much colder and certainly much more violent. And in case we haven't noticed, it also becomes a lot harder. I think Mary Eberstadt said it best when she wrote, quote, "There is a truth amid today's confusions that has gone too long unsaid. Our secularizing culture is not just any culture. Our secularizing culture is an inferior culture. It's small of heart. It defines suffering down. It regards the victims of its social experiments not as victims, but as acceptable collateral damage justified in the name of progress. This is secularism's unspoken secret. It's also secularism's great vulnerability. The mission to define suffering down can be seen, for example, in efforts that would recast the horrors of prostitution as anodyne sex work. It drives the attempts to normalize pornography, ignoring the calamitous cost to men and women in romance. It powers the push to shut down emergency pregnancy centers and adoption agencies, indifferent to whether babies and children and the poor need them. It whitewashes data about suicide rates, eating disorders, substance abuse, and other indices of mental distress, including among the transgender population. Similarly, does secularism overlook other suffering, especially among the children and teenagers of the post-revolution, when acknowledging such harms might jeopardize political agendas, unquote. We are, of course, left to wonder what to do next. If we are to be the inheritors of the gift of the resurrection, if the power of death is to have no more power over us, then we must claim our place in a world in which we are not intimidated by the only power the world can have over us. And that is the power to snuff out our voice and deaden our place by extinguishing us. Mostly that's done by the threat of diminishment rather than by killing us. But at bottom, all threats are built on our fear of dying. If we're threatened with losing our job or our money, we face the prospect of not getting along in life. And if we don't get along, we will be extinguished. We'll die. If our reputation is taken away from us and our value to society is taken away, then the support we need in order to confront the intricate cruelty of the world will be shaken and will be overcome by chaos and death. If our freedoms are threatened and we face the prospect of incarceration and separation, so that we can't provide for ourselves or for those in our lives, and our families will diminish and we will lose our lives or our livelihood, That's what we're afraid of. At bottom, the threat to us is that death will overcome us. Inheriting the gift of the resurrection, we know God will stand with us and death is not the end. We can afford to witness to the truth because even if it costs us our lives, we will share in the life of Christ. This is the power we have been promised. For Father Stan Rother, it was the impulse he trusted when he offered his life to serve his people and live for the truth of their dignity. The enemies of his ministry thought they could take his power away from him by taking his life from him. They trusted death to keep their society and their place in it working for them. As we know from his witness, it has not been so. Killing him prompted the very change and the fundamental dignity that he lived for. Trusting in resurrection allowed him to live a life larger than life. And that is the same gift offered to us. Our hope is to trust in the Easter message, especially as the clouds gather around the empty tomb. The societies formed by the power of the gospel message are abandoning it as quickly as they can in favor of making the world congenial to them. Our true hope is to proclaim the truth of the resurrection, but also to live it. And we live it by standing for the gift of life in every place at every time. The most powerful gift of a Christian culture is to proclaim that by God's initiative, the power to kill is only transitory and will achieve only temporary good. The age of Caiaphas is drawing to an end. But that brings us to the next great challenge. If death is no longer a tool to make the world a congenial place, what is next? How will the world become a place where we can live? After all, killing does achieve our goals, even if they're only temporary. What comes of us when we abandon it? We will end up living without the protections we're used to, without the guarantees of our systems built on intimidation, coercion, and fear. Our model will have to be something like the apostles. They who saw Jesus risen from the dead knew there was no power that would constrain them. They were free to live on a wholly different plane of being and understanding, making their way in the world as God prompted them and the Spirit guided them. That's our course now. What better time to be alive? We're given this time in which the distinction between belief and unbelief grows more and more stark. The choices presented to the world and the choices we represent are between life and death, between a world brimming with the vitality of the future and a world slowly extinguishing. And we are the ones who are entrusted with the future of life and glory. How could we not proclaim it? How could the world not embrace it? It only waits for us to do it. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called Our Lives Are Saved. Our lives are saved every day, for we know not what. The eternal plan, the possibilities that can be realized tomorrow. It's easy to hold in thought the times we were caught up in danger, when the prospects dimmed and our futures were rimmed in crepe. At that moment, our crisis, when all was decisive, we gasped, glad we survived again, and our lives could lend a hand to the future. But every day is such. Each moment touches eternity, and the day that brings her home lingers upon our breath, so that every moment then is the time akin to forever. Each moment is pointed there, all anointed for God's own purpose. That's Our Lives Are Saved. The world is a complicated and tough place, but we have at our side Jesus who accompanies us. I hope in the weeks to come that you can continue to join us here on Living Catholic as we celebrate this Christ who is among us.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.